Hi, dual language friends. This is Amy, your dual language coach from dualcoach.com. And today we're going to talk about using quadranting, specifically using language quadrants to make bilingual pairs of students. Okay, a quadrant is a really useful tool you can use whenever you're comparing two things. I've used them to compare students' content knowledge and their language and the language of instruction for that content area. It's really helpful for making partnerships. But today is really about making bilingual buddies that encourage students to work with somebody who has different proficiencies from them, and I think it really supports my own personal goal of building social justice within my classroom so that that can transfer and make the world a better place and a more socially just place. So let's look at how language quadrants can help us do that. Okay. One of the things I always tell people I love about dual language is that my native Spanish speakers that maybe don't have as much social capital in the community outside my classroom because they're not proficient in English can use what they do know in Spanish, and suddenly in my classroom they are the experts. They're the ones that hold the keys, and I really love that about dual immersion. So let's look. This is the tool. It's Language Quadrants, and the way I've set it up, you can make your own on PowerPoint. It's really easy, just a two rows and two columns table. But I set the x-axis to be for Spanish. So kids who have lower Spanish proficiency will be at the left side, and kids who have higher Spanish proficiency will be at the right side. And my y-axis is going to be English. So kids with lower English proficiency will be on the bottom, and kids with higher English proficiency will be toward the top. So I use the Lost Links. Our district is lucky enough to have some data on our students' proficiencies coming in. Not everybody has that, and so you can use whatever you do have. Maybe it's teacher observation, maybe it's what parents have said about your students or a previous year teacher, or maybe it's just whether they signed up to be a Spanish speaker or an English speaker. So sometimes you're really guessing, and that's okay because this is not a science. This is more of an art. And because it's not permanent, your language buddies can be together for 2, 3, 4 weeks, and then you're going to want to switch them so that they can have a chance to work with somebody else as a language buddy. And also because kids' proficiencies change at different rates. And so when one pair is working in the beginning of the year, that might not be a great pairing toward the end of the year. So what you're going to do is create a text box. So in PowerPoint, you just go to Insert and Text Box, and you can put it anywhere. I'm going to put mine all the way over here off my slide so I can decide where I want to put it. And so you're going to write the student's name and their proficiencies. Because Spanish is my x-axis, that's intentional so that I can write the Spanish score first. Because every little thing that we can do to elevate the status of the partner language or target language, minority language, Spanish in our case, I think helps. So thinking about Spanish first, make sure Spanish is included and at the forefront. So when I started school, my Spanish proficiency was none at all. So I would have scored a 1 on a pre-lesson Spanish, and I was very proficient in English, and so I probably would have scored a 5 on the pre-less in English. Did I say that right? 1 in Spanish, 5 in English. So now I have to figure out which quadrant I go in. So I know that I have a 1 in Spanish, so I know that I'm going to be on the left side of the graph. So now it's just figuring out, am I at the top or am I at the bottom? And so now we look at my English proficiency, and because I had high English proficiency, I would be up in this quadrant. Now, some people like to make sure like I'm all the way over here because I'm really low Spanish proficiency, up here because I have high English proficiency. I don't think it really matters as long as you have the student in the correct quadrant. So what do you do if you have a student who has a on the last links it would be a 3 and a sort of medium proficiency. Well, look at the rest of your class and decide, is that on the high end for your class or is that on the low end for your class? Okay, so let's take a look at what a class might look like. I had my I had my daughters create a class list for me with only 16 students. Aren't I lucky? And create the proficiencies just so I wouldn't be able to make an easy class for myself. I wanted it to be a little bit challenging. So let's see what we have. When I look to make partnerships, I want to make sure my students who have the least language privilege, I want to make sure they have the very best partner for them. And so when I start that, I know that outside my classroom, the students with low proficiency in English will have the least language privilege. And so I'm going to actually look at Jorge in the low quadrant. Now, this does not mean that poor Jorge doesn't have any language. Of course he has language, but Jorge uses both of his languages. And so when we think of him as a holistic bilingual student, I'm not worried at all. If I were just looking at his Spanish or his English, I might be worried. I might say, oh, Jorge is not proficient in either language. Oh no, what will we do? We're not going to really worry about Jorge. His proficiency will grow. If there are other things that indicate that we should be worried about Jorge's language use, then we will use this as another data point. But just having a 2 in English language proficiency and a 2 in Spanish language proficiency is not a concern for me right now. What is a concern is making sure that Jorge has a chance to be the expert in his bilingual buddy pair. So I need to find somebody that has less proficiency when compared to monolingual speakers in either English or Spanish. So my choices are Zoe, who has lower proficiency in Spanish, Daisy, who has lower proficiency in Spanish, David, who has lower proficiency in English, and Mari, who has lower proficiency in English. And it doesn't really matter. I think logistically, just because I have more kids in this quadrant than this, I might try pairing Jorge up with David. So David has a higher proficiency in Spanish, so he's going to be a support and a model for Jorge when we need to use our Spanish as monolinguals. And Jorge will be a support for David when we need to use our English as monolinguals in the classroom during separation of language time. So now let's look at other kids. I'm going to take Jack next because although Jack is in the high end of the English, he just barely made it in there. So I want to make sure Jack can be an expert and be in a position of power. So I'm going to take Asia. She looks like she'll be a good partner for Jack. They have similar proficiencies, but Jack is a little bit stronger than Asia in English, and Asia is a little stronger than Jack in Spanish. So hopefully they'll both have the chance to be an expert. Okay, I have 3 students here now. Diego, and these are all proficient Spanish speakers. They're not at that advanced level, but they are definitely proficient, and they are developing still proficiency in English when they need to use it as a monolingual. And so it doesn't really matter who I'm choosing as long as they both have chances to be experts. So I'm going to pull Devin over. Now, I am not concerning myself right now with if I'm matching girls with girls and boys with boys or boys with girls, because they need to know that everybody works together in our classroom. And so that won't ever be a concern of mine. And then I have Zoe and Mari. I'm not going to concern myself with behaviors right now either, because although I've gotten plenty of warnings from the teachers that had them before me, I know that these are elementary students and they change over the summer, and I have a different teaching style than the previous teacher, and so kids that were easy for her are going to be hard for me, and kids that were hard for her are going to be easy for me. And we just kind of need to figure that out. Certainly, I want to be proactive and have some strategies in place for the kiddos that struggled behaviorally with the teacher from last year. But I'm not really going to worry about that when I'm making my pairs this time. I have enough to worry about. So now I have all my pairs made, and I have only kids left in the high quadrant. And so what I want to make sure of is that the kids at the highest, like Alejandro, I need Alejandro to have some chances to be a learner. And so you'll notice that I don't have anybody that's a 5-5. If I had 5-5s, I would match them together and hope they could learn from each other. But I do have Mari. Now I already paired Mari with Zoe, so I'm going to pull Mari out and match her with Alejandro. Because now Mari is a stronger, at least according to this assessment, is a stronger Spanish speaker than Alejandro, and Alejandro is a stronger English speaker than Mari. So they might both have a chance to be an expert. So now I need to pair somebody with Zoe. So I have Brandon and Brianna, who are both 3-3s, and Isabella, who is a 3-4. So Zoe could be an expert in Spanish for any of these students, okay? But if I pull one of my 3-3s, they're going to be paired with Isabella, and they might not ever get a chance to be an expert. They might always be learning from Isabella. So I'm going to pull my 3-3s and put them together. It's not the same dynamic as having one of them be an expert and the other one not be an expert until we get to the other language. But because they're closely matched, and we'll see if they're really closely matched once they get to the classroom, they can still learn from each other as peers, really. And I'm going to put Isabella with Zoe. So Isabella will be the expert when we're in Spanish, and Zoe will be the expert when we're in English. And so there are my bilingual pairs. I'm going to make sure I have them sitting next to each other so they can rely on each other. I'm not going to switch them right away when they start to not get along, because our third goal, that multicultural competence goal, is all about differences and figuring out what's the same about us and how do we interact with each other when there are differences. And so I really need to support that goal through my bilingual partnerships, and not getting along is a great opportunity for that kind of social learning. Okay. I'm also going to make sure my English component teacher has the same kids in partnerships. Why? Because we lose the social justice value, right? If my let's take somebody here, Zoe. So Isabella is teaching Zoe during Spanish time, and so Zoe's at a disadvantage. And so the next week or day, or however your separation is structured, I want Zoe to be in a position of power, and I want Isabella to be learning from the same person. Okay? I would love to hear how your language quadrants work out for you. If you have any questions, feel free, and I will answer them the best I can. I'm not an expert on using language quadrants. I've tried it before, and I like the potential it has, but you might find a better way, and I'd love to hear about it. This is Amy, your Dual Language Coach at dualcoach.com. Thank you.